The Way of the Cross, Part 1, with images created by members of Christ Church Ardlsey Parish and poetic meditations from The Gift of a Cross by Pat Marsh, led by Sam Elmore, with Bible readings read by Maria Elmore. The Stations of the Cross mark a devotional journey where we follow the path of Jesus from Pilate to Calvary, pausing to be still at each step. Last year, the church family of Christ Church Ardlsey created their own images to help others reflect. We will be using those images again in this video, whilst hearing words of scripture and reflection. In order to provide a still and unadorned experience, there is no music in this video. However, please feel free to pause the video here if you'd prefer to play some quiet music, or if you want to grab a cross that you can hold, or a Bible, if you feel that these things would be helpful to you. Station 1. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Matthew 26, verses 36 to 39. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee. Grief and anguish came over him, and he said to them, "The sorrow in my heart is so great that it almost crushes me. Stay here and keep watch with me." He went a little farther on, threw himself face downwards on the ground, and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, take this cup of suffering from me, yet not what I want, but what you want."
I needed to pray. Now, more than ever before, I had to pray. Supper was over, the last we would share this side of the resurrection. I left the 3 sitting under a tree, their backs against the rough bark, their prayers soaked in the pungent smell of olives. I asked them to watch and to wait and to pray. Down on my knees, the tension and turmoil, intense within, too tight to voice, the whole of my guts in a rigid knot, sweat pouring out of my hands and face, red like blood, muscles and sinews tense with anticipation. Did God really want me to go through this? Take it away, this cup of suffering. Lord, I can no longer bear the agony tearing me apart inside. How can anyone face death when they know that the hour of it is coming? How does anyone find the strength to go through torture when they're given advance notice? I would do anything for the Father, but this, I really wasn't sure if I had the strength of body, mind and spirit. I certainly knew I couldn't do it from within my own resources. So once again, before a pivotal moment in my ministry, I had to pray. Please, take this cup away from me. But the olive grove echoed loud with silence. Never had I felt so distant from the God who was my Father, never so lonely. And yet I knew it had to be. Not my will, but your will be done. Station 2. Jesus is arrested.
Matthew 26, verses 47 to 50. Jesus was still speaking when Judas, one of the 12 disciples, arrived. With him was a large crowd, armed with swords and clubs, and sent by the chief priests and the elders. The traitor had given the crowd a signal. "The man I kiss is the one you want. Arrest him." Judas went straight to Jesus and said, "Peace be with you, teacher," and kissed him. Jesus answered, "Be quick about it, friend." Then they came up, arrested Jesus, and held him tight.
It began as a faint whisper, imperceptible, almost inaudible in the far distance, gently breaking into the stillness of night, and to begin with faint glimmers of light shimmering orange behind the shadows of the olive trees. And long before the disciples understood the approaching noise, before the growing whisper had risen to a crescendo, Jesus fully realized what was about to happen. The tramp of a whole battalion of boots crashing through the undergrowth, the clash of cold steel weapons against leather, and the volley of soldiers' voices were suddenly upon them, the bright hot glow of flaming torches fueling the atmosphere of tension. But the agony of the earlier Gethsemane moments gone. Jesus reflected only calm acceptance, his coming death the very reason for living. Whom are you looking for? Station 3. Jesus is condemned to death.
Matthew 27, verses 57 and 59 to 66. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. Now the chief priests and the whole council sought false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said, sir, but I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death."
There never was a case to answer. Nothing made sense about the arrest of this man, his trial a trumped-up travesty of justice, driven by corruption, self-interest, priests who should know better. They judged him by their own values and found him to be wanting, as their sins stood out in sharp relief against the openness of his love. His principles clashed loudly with their prophets. The case of the high priests versus Jesus of Nazareth. Whatever the false litigation, popularity was his crime. He was simply too well liked. The strength of his following undermined their power. He knew of the rife corruption, the rich lining their pockets. Why else overturn the tables in the holy place? And if these stories about resurrection began to gain ground, the ones that had grown since he raised Lazarus, and all people aspired to live as one big family under God, who knows what would happen? Their wealth, the priests, would all be for nothing. He had to be stopped. There'd be nothing short of a riot if the following grew, and then the Romans would intervene and all would be totally lost. They were doing the people a favour. Better to let one man die than to have a whole nation destroyed. It never did make any sense, this trial. But they had to make the charges stick. Any charge would do. The verdict already decided. Station 4. Peter denies Jesus.
Mark 14, verse 72. At that moment the cock crowed for the second time. Then Peter remembered that Jesus had said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." and he broke down and wept.
It was the anger that threw me off guard, pitched my nerves off balance, sent me on the defensive. Don't much like anger, you see. I've always been one for keeping the peace, whatever the cost to me. Such a simple, unguarded moment. I denied it. I denied him. Said I wasn't a disciple of his. And before the words had left my tongue, almost immediately I hated myself. Couldn't believe the things I'd heard myself voicing. I was lying big style. He was everything to me. I loved him so very much. He turned my whole life completely around, and not just me. He was changing lives everywhere he went, healing the sick, teaching forgiveness, loving everyone, whoever they were, whatever they'd done. Funny that I denied him. A couple of days earlier, when he'd hinted I would deny him, 3 times, he said, I told him he was wrong. Said I'd die for him first. I loved him that much. Funny that. In the end, that's what he did for me.